Thank you very much. It is an extraordinary pleasure to to be able to talk to my old friend, Jamie Kirchick, who has been working on a book for, 35 years? No, for a long time, diligently. And what he's produced is a remarkable book. I think it's remarkable because I've waited to read this book my whole adult life. It is a book that is the first book to explain Washington as a gay city. We all have this idea of San Francisco and New York and LA in their different ways, but Washington is as gay, if not gayer, than those, and it's a very different experience. And those of us who've lived there and love it just had nowhere to go to read the actual story of what we are seeing around us and what we knew happened in history. And secondly, it's really an important book about the history of the gay rights movement. And probably the greatest misleading element of the way so many people understand it, in my opinion, is that they think it started in 1969 in New York. And that was a very important point in the culture. I don't want to deny that importance. It was electrifying in many ways, but work had been going on a long time before that. And among the most important work was being done in Washington, which was one of the scariest cities to live in as well. Just before we start, just one statistic. In the 1950s, no one gay person could work for the federal government agencies or those it contracted to were at risk of immediate termination. And the police state, which is the only way to describe it, was more intense than any other place. Partly because there was no other reason to actually hunt down gay men, but they did. I think 10,000 people were fired.
We don't really know the figures. It's been estimated 7,000 to 10,000 people.
Yeah. Probably the most awful period of anti-gay persecution by the government, active persecution in history, and a police department that got gays to tell on each other that were black. Anyway, it goes on. And somehow that has not been a subject properly covered. And I am thrilled that it has been, and that it will add some perspective to a somewhat distorted understanding of where we come from as a movement. It's a brilliant book. It's incredibly fun to read. It's got lots of gossip, lots of stories, lots of jokes, lots of gayness actually in it, which is fantastic. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I mean so much. Thank you.
So tell us, what is the Washington gay type? Like we have an idea of like New York and other places, and P-Town, which is very much in New York. How would you describe your average Washington gay?
Well, it's really the best little boy in the world, which is the term that Andy Tobias came up with to describe himself in his memoir. This is the overachieving perfectionist boy who does not all the energies that should be going into chasing girls like all of his peers. He's putting into extracurricular activities and schoolwork and pleasing his teachers, right? And there are positive aspects to this personality type, but there are also negative ones. And I think I made the connection that this was a Washington type when I first moved to Washington in 2007. And I realized there are a lot of gay men in this city, and they're in particular jobs, like chiefs of staff on Capitol Hill. It's like a very gay job. Or like press secretary. It just is. There's lots of gay men doing it. Lobbying organizations, associations, right? The Association of Dental whatever, like the guys, whatever the group was, there are lots of gay men in these organizations. And I think it's because the city of Washington and what it requires, the traits that are necessary for success in Washington are many traits that this particular type of gay man possesses or possessed. Maybe they don't possess them anymore because the closet is receding from American life. And so that best little boy in the world, I don't think he really exists that much anymore. I mean, I was one. You were one in your own way. A lot of us were. But I think we're going to see less of that, probably.
Yeah, we'll see less of it, but it's just absolutely the way in which a young kid internalizes shame about homosexuality will always. I mean, I'm gloomy about this, but I think at some point, no one wants to be different when they're 12, and some of that will create this. And you can see them. I mean, certainly today, there's absence of Smithers's sort of all over Washington.
Right.
Smithers is
you have to explain this.
Monty Burns' famous gay aide. But
it's a cultural archetype, and you see it in film, in television, in literature. The kind of sinister homosexual advisor, lurking in the background. It's something that is a kind of a recurring theme. And I don't write about this in the book. I had an essay in New York Magazine this week where I sort of trace the kind of origins of this to this scandal that occurred in the early 1900s in Wilhelmine, Germany, so pre-World War I Germany, where the emperor, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, was accused by a journalist of being surrounded by a homosexual clique of advisors. And this is sort of the birth of kind of 20th century conspiratorial homophobia. And so this notion that it's very similar to anti-Semitism in this way, actually, and that homophobia, there's there's the religious Judeo-Christian influenced hatred of gay people, which is kind of the predominant one. There's the sort of hatred of gay men in particular based on a disgust for their sexual activity. And then there's this kind of conspiratorial view that, if there's like two gay men in a room, right, then there must be something going on, right? If there's two gay men and it's very similar to anti-Semitism, right? Like if there's two Jews involved in this organization, or I can draw a line between, this Jew and that Jew, and it's very similar to that. Because I think Jews, like gays, they're a diasporic people. They're spread out throughout the world. They're accused of being not loyal to their nation, but to the term that I come across in the book, the Homintern, the homosexual international, which is actually this was a play on the Comintern, the Communist International. This was actually a fear in the 1950s, all the way up to this scandal that I uncovered, probably the biggest scoop in the book, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was being accused of being controlled by a cabal of right-wing homosexual advice. It sounds crazy today, but this was actually brought to the attention of the Washington Post. And so the echoes of this scandal in the early 20th century, just the same kind of, in different guises, you see it throughout the decades.
But if you take out the word sinister, there is a kernel of truth in this too, that of course in a city where it was for a lot of time illegal to be working for the government and be gay, yes, of course people connected with one another quietly. Yes, of course there was a network of people who understood each other, and yes, there was a network in which people were promoted and helped out. Lots of, as you put it, one period, like these younger, beautiful men were suddenly getting posts here, there, and everywhere. I mean, we shouldn't. I mean, you detail it in the book. It's like those sinister conspiracies are obviously untrue. But the idea that gays didn't know who each other were, they didn't have a separate language, they didn't meet in place. I mean. And that's what scared people. And they couldn't tell who was a homo and who wasn't. Right. So they figured out, you saw this in Nixon, right? Was it one of Nick? I'm trying to remember. One of the briefs they were given, the cops were like, well, there are lots of people very effeminate, but they go by Butch too, and you can't tell. Yeah. And there are some ones that are completely indistinguishable from
J. Edgar Hoover explaining to Richard Nixon. Some of them you can tell by the way they walk, but some of them are also very masculine, and so they're undetectable,
so to speak. And you actually, interestingly, in the book, push back a little bit at the idea that Hoover and Tulsa was gay.
Well, I have to be very scrupulous in this book, and there's no evidence that J. Edgar Hoover was gay. There's lots of circumstantial evidence that he was gay. I mean, he was a bachelor his entire life. He had this very doting and affectionate relationship with his number two, Clyde Tolson. They ate together at the Mayflower Hotel every day. They traveled together on vacation. You can see the photographs of them looking rather affectionately at each other. So it is this strange paradox, right, that the man sitting atop American law enforcement who's responsible for this purge of gay people might have been gay himself. And we certainly know that he was incredibly sensitive to the rumors and allegations. And I think some of the wildest anecdotes in the book are about the lengths to which the FBI would go to just quash rumors about J. Edgar Hoover being gay. And there's one vignette I tell where it's a group of, this is 1943, it's a group of women playing bridge in some small town in Ohio. And apropos of whatever, maybe reading about him in the newspaper, one of the ladies says, while they're playing cards, that J. Edgar Hoover, he's a homosexual, he's a queer.
Queer is the word she used.
Queer, he's a queer. Turns out one of the other women in the bridge club, her nephew, is in the bureau, works for the FBI. She mentions it to her nephew. The nephew tells his boss. It goes all the way up to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The next day, the woman who uttered this at the bridge party is called into the FBI field office in Chicago or St. Louis, whatever the nearest city was. And she's given a stern talking to by the special agent in charge. What are you doing spreading? This is in the middle of World War II, right? What are you doing? We're in the middle of a global war, and the director has responsibility for the safety of this country, and you're spreading. Where did you hear this? And she tells him, well, I was visiting Washington. We were at and she goes into all this detail about where she heard the rumor that the director was a queer. And the agent instructs her, you go and you tell your friends in this bridge club that what you said was false. And in the next week at the bridge club, she tells them, it was, and there's multiple examples of this, of private citizens just having what they believe are conversations, right, in a cafe, to a friend, in a diner. It gets overheard by someone. They report it to the bureau, and it's quashed. But then it's funny, as the book develops, in the 60s and 70s, I came across these stories of people going through a background security check because they needed to get a job in the government, and the FBI was the ones who would conduct these investigations. And there's actually a moment when Henry Kissinger is going to become national security advisor, and the FBI agents are interviewing one of his former graduate students. And because Henry Kissinger was a bachelor at this time, they started asking questions that were sort of suggestive. Well, is he a homosexual? And the graduate student, says to the agents, well, I don't know, but your boss might know, right? So by that point, in the late 60s and early 70s, people would joke to the FBI agents about Hoover being a homosexual. And by that point, the impression that I got was that these agents had heard this so much, right, that people would just make jokes about it. But by that point, they just kind of waved it off and didn't.
Well, it is true that he cross-dressed.
No, absolutely
no, it's not.
No, there's no. That
really
story.
Didn't?
That story comes from.
Okay. Did anybody else here?
Everyone believes that.
Jack
Everyone
Hoover.
believes that. In fact, that's one of the most common. When I would tell people I was writing a book about gay Washington, there were a few things I would, get asked. One was always, well, Lindsey Graham's going to be in that book, right? But then the other one was J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover is a cross-dresser, right? And it's one of the most commonly believed things about him, largely, I think, because of the film, J. Edgar, the Clint Eastwood movie, where Leonardo DiCaprio is actually putting on his mother's clothing in a mirror and sort of crying about it, whatever. The origins of this myth, and it is a myth because there's no evidence for it. The origins of this myth come from a biography that was written by a British journalist, so you should immediately be suspicious. Okay. Where the biographer paid, as British journalists often do, he paid for an interview with the widow of a mob boss who Hoover had some dealings with. And she claimed that she was at a party. Why a woman would be invited to one of these parties is besides the point. But she claimed to have been at a party at the Plaza Hotel in New York City where J. Edgar Hoover was in a dress with Roy Cohn, and they were committing depraved sexual acts with young boys. That's the story, okay?
It's Pizzagate,
and
right?
It's basically Pizzagate. But when this book came out, it became such a joke. Like Bill Clinton made a joke about it at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. It just became, by the time that I was old enough to be politically conscious, we all just sort of believed that J. Edgar Hoover was a cross-dresser, but there's no evidence for it.
Who was, in 1948, the entire country and the elections was focused around the issue of homosexuality. 52.
It was a huge issue in 1952.
But in 48, who was...
48 was the Kinsey Report.
Right.
And this is a huge moment. In fact, John Cheever says 1948 was the year everyone was worried about homosexuality. which was something new to me when I was researching this book. And literally all within a month, this is what happens. The Kinsey report comes out January 5th. And the Kinsey report says that, 10% of American men between the ages of 18 and 65 are for 3 years within that period were exclusively homosexual, right? So that famous figure, 10%, comes from the Kinsey report. And this is a total shock to the country because prior to that, the belief was that gay people or homosexuals, because we have to use the terms that were, in the book, I'm very explicit about using language that is appropriate to the times in which I'm writing, right? So the word queer only appears in this book. This has apparently offended some reviewers, but the word only appears in my book when it's used as a slur, because that was the term that was used at the time, was queer. But so most people in America, first of all, they never talked about homosexuality. In fact, one of the other insights I think I discovered in this book was all the euphemisms that were used to describe homosexuality. Even that term, which is a neutral term, was considered, it was just not, you would not speak this word. It was considered bad manners to even utter the word homosexual. So there are all these other ways of speaking about it. And so in 1948, for this report to come out saying that 10% of the male population is homosexual, I mean, that could be the milkman, it could be the teacher, it could be a high-ranking State Department official, as we'll later learn later in that year when a major scandal comes out. A few weeks after that, the Kinsey report is published, Gore Vidal publishes The City and the Pillar, which is, he's 23 at the time. And this is the first major work of American fiction to deal with homosexuality from a sympathetic perspective. And it's a scandalous book. And Vidal would always claim that he was essentially sort of blacklisted by the New York Times, right, because of this book. It so scandalized the literary world. And then that same month, Truman Capote publishes Other Voices, Other Rooms. So you have all this happening in early 1948. And it causes basically a sex panic. And this notion that homosexuals are everywhere. And then what else is going on in America at this time? What's the other group of people who are duplicitous and living in the shadows, and you can't tell what they are just by looking at them? Communists, right? And so this association begins to form culturally, politically. Later that year, I had alluded to it, but Whittaker Chambers, who is a very famous journalist, he's a senior editor at Time magazine, he comes forth, he comes out, so to speak, and says that he had been a communist in the 1930s, and that with him, working with him as a communist, was a man named Alger Hiss, who was a former high-ranking State Department official and the head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. What Chambers doesn't reveal is that he had also been a gay man. He had lived a gay life in the 1930s, cruising for sex in New York and in Washington in public parks. And he's forced to basically confess this privately to the FBI because the Hiss side, Alger Hiss and his allies, are starting a whisper campaign that Whittaker Chambers is a liar, and what this is really all about is that he's a spurned and vindictive homosexual, that he wanted Alger Hiss, and Hiss rejected him, and that all these charges of a communist conspiracy are the words of as Alger Hiss would later say, fairy vengeance, right? Now, as we know from the archives have been opened, Alger Hiss was indeed a spy. Whittaker Chambers was telling the truth. Whittaker Chambers was also gay. I mean, it's hard how he would describe. He goes off and married and had children. But among influential people in Washington, this was never explicitly raised during the trial. It was too dangerous a subject. Even for Hiss's side, they determined for various reasons that if they were to explicitly make the case that Chambers was gay, then people might start asking questions. Well, maybe that does mean Hiss was also gay, because why else would Chambers and Hiss know each other? Did they meet each other in the homosexual underground and not the communist underground? So it was deemed too dangerous for the Hiss defense team to use it. But we see that develops within this sort of cultural political sphere this association of communists and homosexuals, that they're one and the same.
And it's funny, when my first arrival in New York City as a non-citizen, I on the form coming in, I had to swear that I was not a communist or a homosexual.
As late as the 1980s.
The 1980s, which wasn't taken off the immigration form for visas until the early 90s. Barney did it, as I recall.
Most people don't know that.
it's hard to say. But Chambers and Hiss, this thing absolutely obsessed people for a very long time.
It's the first televised congressional hearing in America.
And tell us about the 52 campaign. That's what
Right.
Because then suddenly it begins to happen that some of these people connected with presidents are also homosexuals. And then you have this panic about.
So we have to, 1950 is another, so February 1950, I just said January 1948 was a very important month in the history of homosexuality. February 1950 is also really important. What happens? February 9th, Joe McCarthy gives his famous speech to the ladies of, the Republican ladies of Wheeling, West Virginia, where he's got his list of 205 communists in the State Department, right? And that sets off a panic. Later that month, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, is called up to testify on Capitol Hill, along with a deputy of his. And just in passing, when they're basically answering these charges that McCarthy has made, and in passing, they're talking about people who've been separated from the State Department for various reasons, right? And he says that 91 homosexuals have been fired from the State Department since 1947. This comes as a huge shock, almost more shocking than. It actually is more shocking because there weren't 205 communists in the State Department. That was a lie. And that number, by the way, changed every day when McCarthy was asked about it. Some days it would be 205, other days it would be 78, whatever. But 91 homosexuals, absolutely. They were in the State Department and they were kicked out. And in fact, there's one little anecdote, a sort of statistic, but of the thousands of letters that Joe McCarthy got from people all across the country writing into him in the aftermath of these revelations, only 25% of the letters were about communists in the State Department. The rest of them were all about perverts or sexual deviants, right? So within the public imagination, this is a real fear.
And it's also true that the State Department was full of homosexuals.
Yeah, so the State Department was, you could say, relatively a more tolerant place for gay people, just in this. I mean, if you think about it, what sort of job allows you as a bachelor to kind of get away with being a bachelor, right? You can join, you're in the Foreign Service, you have to travel long overseas tours. So it sort of provided us a relatively, it was not, it wasn't P-Town, okay? But it was a relatively, you could sort of get away, okay? Because it was also for upper class. You had to be very wealthy to be in the State Department in this era. It was all kind of upper class WASPs. But that 1950s when the Lavender Scare begins, right? Those revelations come out. The Lavender Scare begins. There's a government, a Senate subcommittee launches an investigation. They come out with a report calling for the purge of gay people from federal government jobs. The State Department becomes associated in the public mind with homosexualdy. And in fact, there's a New Yorker cartoon from 1950 that I don't reproduce in the book, but you can find it online, where it's just a typical New Yorker cartoon, and it shows a man applying for a job, and he says, yes, sir, it's true, I was fired from the State Department, but it was only for incompetence, right? Because that's how, and this is the New Yorker, okay? This is the most elite, prestigious, liberal publication in the country, right? Every right-thinking, bien pensant, liberal person is reading this magazine. This is how they refer to the State Department, and obviously their readers are well acquainted enough that the joke didn't need to be explained. Like, we all get, yes, State Department means queer. That's what it means. So in 1952, the Republicans are running, and one of the major issues, I mean, the campaign slogan is to clean up Washington. And that's mostly a reference to the corruption of the Truman administration, but it also is very much a reference to the moral depravity in the State Department. And the term lavender lads gets introduced into the discourse. The lavender lads at the State Department. J. Edgar Hoover is spreading rumors that Adlai Stevenson is a queer. Adlai Stevenson, who is 3 deadly things. He is a bachelor at the time. He's divorced. He is a former diplomat, and he's an intellectual, right? So these 3 things make this rumor really testy. And it becomes really, you could say, the first campaign, presidential campaign or election, in which gay people become an issue. Not the last. But.
Who was the most powerful gay man in the 20th century in Washington?
Oh, wow. Well, excluding J. Edgar Hoover. If we don't know.
If he was,
he would have absolutely, it would be him. Oh, that's a good question.
Roy Cohn?
I don't know how much of a Washington figure he is. He's certainly in the book. There's an entire chapter on the Army McCarthy hearings, and we can get into him. But he kind of doesn't. He kind of leaves Washington after that.
Yeah, but
he's more of a New York. But he is certainly a power broker. Absolutely,
he came back like a bad meal with his client, Trump.
Well, yes,
that style of politics. Yeah,
that's a good question. I'll have to actually think about that. I should probably know that question because it seems like an obvious one that I'm going to be asked on this book tour. I'll have to dwell on that. Before I give an
let's go each president and tell me the gay man closest to them that was most popular.
We'll start with
FDR.
FDR. So yeah, his basically his de facto Secretary of State was a man named Sumner Welles, who was the Undersecretary of State, but he was an old Roosevelt family friend, third in his class at Harvard. Rose very quickly up the State Department ranks, was ambassador to Cuba at age 28 or something. And he becomes Undersecretary of State. The Secretary of State is a man named Cordell Hull, who's a Southern Democrat who FDR does not like, but he needs him because he needs to appease the Southern wing of his party, right? But Hull is this old man he's tubercular. He has like tuberculosis. And he's often sick and can't fulfill his duties. And so Welles is the man that basically runs the State Department. And because of this, Hull is very resentful, as is another man named William Bullitt, who I think is actually one of the most fascinating characters in the book. William Bullitt was the first ambassador to the Soviet Union. He was ambassador to France. He was this bon vivant. He was a playwright. He was married to Louise Bryant, a local, right? Louise Bryant was married to John Reed, the great communist journalist who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. She was his widow. William Bullitt had married her. She goes off and has a lesbian relationship. This really angers William Bullitt. Bullitt goes on. I mean, I could go on, but Bullitt co-authors a psychobiography with Sigmund Freud of Woodrow Wilson, in which they basically blame the failure of the Versailles Treaty on Wilson's latent homosexuality. That's basically the thesis of this book. They each have their own reasons for hating Wilson. Bullitt because Bullitt worked for Wilson and testified against the Versailles Treaty, and it basically destroyed his diplomatic career. Freud because he lamented the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I, which he blamed Wilson for. The two of them hated Wilson. They write this book. It's not published until the 1960s, long after Freud dies. But they basically accuse, and it just shows you how homosexuality is this. It's always associated with the worst things. So I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but when Americans were fighting fascism, I came across all these government documents that there are serious inquiries into whether or not the Nazis are a gay, if it's a gay phenomenon. If Nazism is a gay phenomenon, and there's actually this proposal that comes to the OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA, where they're thinking of, should we recruit patriotic homosexual men to infiltrate the Nazi high command, because they're all a bunch of queers. Well, gay men can't serve in the military. They can't serve in this is World War II. They can't serve in the military, but maybe we could use them to infiltrate and spy on the Nazis, right? And then when communism is our threat, we associate communism with homosexuals. Pedophilia is associated with homosexuals. The worst things are repeatedly associated with gay people, with gay men, and really gay men in particular. And it's just a recurring theme in the book, and you'll see it. It's just whatever is bad or whatever is mysterious, whatever we can. The Kennedy assassination. I mean, I have a whole chapter. Has anyone here seen the movie JFK? Do you remember the plot of the movie is basically, it's the most homophobic movie ever made. Go back and watch it. The plot of this movie, which is based on a real prosecution, by the way, Jim Garrison, who was the New Orleans district attorney, basically he alleged that there was a right-wing homosexual cabal that killed Kennedy as part of a homosexual thrill killing. That was his term. This is the basis of JFK, which was nominated for 5 Academy Awards. Sorry, I got off on a tangent there, but you're talking about the most...
We took it the closest, so it would be Welles for FDR.
Truman, I couldn't come across anyone.
Now, Wells is
Yeah.
basically Secretary of State.
He's basically
So
Secretary of State.
FDR, that's a bloody
For FDR,
powerful
it's a
position.
very powerful position. He writes the Atlantic Charter.
Right.
He's responsible for the Wells Declaration, which is a very important diplomatic concept which pledged that the United States would not recognize the annexation of the Baltic states, the three little Baltic states, which had been annexed by the Soviet Union. There was a lot of pressure to just recognize it. The United States said, no, we're not going to recognize it. And it's a very important diplomatic concept because today, when the Russians have annexed other territory, Crimea, we don't recognize that annexation of Crimea. There's been a lot of pressure to do so, but we don't. And that all goes back to Sumner Wells.
Truman,
I couldn't come across any gay men close to him.
Yeah.
Eisenhower, basically the man most responsible for getting him elected, is a man named Arthur Vandenberg Jr., who's the son of Arthur Vandenberg, who was the great Republican internationalist senator who basically went from being an isolationist to being when for Pearl Harbor happens, he becomes an internationalist and he works with FDR and he works with Truman to basically create the post-war world, right? It's his son, Arthur Jr., what was the head of the Citizens for Eisenhower committee, right, which was the committee to draft Ike to run as a Republican for president in 1952. He's very close to Ike. He's preparing to go in to be his appointments secretary, which sounds like just the guy who's keeping the calendar. It's actually a very important job. He's basically, like the number 3. And then J. Edgar Hoover, this recurring figure, happens a lot. You'll see him a lot in the book. In December 1952, he visits Ike at the Commodore Hotel, which is his transition headquarters in New York City. And he comes with information that Arthur Vandenberg is a homosexual and gives it to Ike. And there's not even, it's like a split. He vaguely threatens Ike in a way. It's interesting. Not threatens, but he basically says to him, look, if Arthur Vandenberg doesn't go into the administration, we won't pursue this anymore, right? So it's basically, you see this often with presidents. Hoover comes in with some secret, the title of my book, Secret City. He has some secret information, and he basically fires an arrow across the bow. And that's all he needs to say, because it's a kind of almost mafia-like, nice presidential advisor you have there. It would be really painful. It would be bad if anything happened to him, right? And then like that, he's gone. He's gone. They kind of massage it in the press. They say, he's having medical issues. He's checked himself into a hospital. And, 4 months into the Eisenhower administration, it's announced that Art Jr. won't be taking the job. It's a tragic story. He goes off to teach at a university, and then out of the blue, in 1956, right? So like 3 years after he's essentially fired, Confidential magazine, which was one of the most popular magazines in America, basically the forerunner to the supermarket tabloid, and it really pioneers the practice of outing in American culture. They out him, and they publish photographs of his home, and they tell the story of when he was a soldier and how he was supposedly, the swish in the unit. That was another term that was used for gay people, swish. Swastika swishery was a term that what's his name? The famous radio.
Coughlin.
No. The other, Walter Winchell. He came up with that term, swastika swishery, again to describe this association between Nazis and gay people.
Okay, I'm going to keep going.
Confidential out. Okay, so then JFK. So JFK is sort of interesting in this perspective because his best friend is gay, and the first chapter on JFK is called First Friends, because he is really the first president to sort of be comfortable around gay men in a way that no other president had been. So his best friend, Lem Billings from Choate, is gay. He knows this because Lem once propositioned him when they were at school, and I think unlike most men of that era, Kennedy was pretty relaxed about it. They remained best friends for the rest of their lives. Kennedy's also friends with Gore Vidal through marriage because Jackie's related to him. Truman Capote, Joe Alsop, it's hard to.
Joe Alsop was an incredibly important journalist.
Yeah.
He was
back in the era when newspaper columnists were really, really influential.
People blamed him for the Vietnam War.
Yes, right. Joe Alsop is, again, like many of the characters in this book, a kind of WASP sort of WASP hierarchy. He's related to the Roosevelts, and he's gay. And there's a great story about him in 1957. He's a militant anti-communist. He's visiting Moscow on a reporting trip. He interviews Khrushchev. Okay, it's a very important trip. And then one evening, he is seduced by a KGB officer undercover, right? And photographs are taken of him in his Moscow hotel room, compromising photographs with this young man. The next day, it's immediately, the next day the young man invites him again for another assignation. He goes, and what happened? Who busts into the door? These KGB guys. They throw down the photos. And what's interesting is that Alsop, they try to blackmail him, right? They try to coerce him into being a source for them back in Washington. And what's fascinating is Alsop does exactly what J. Edgar Hoover and the other leaders of the American national security state would want a gay man to do in this situation. He writes down a full confession of everything that happened. He calls it an act of very great folly, his falling for this man, right, and being led into this honey trap is the term, the espionage term. He writes out a full confession. He says that I've been an incurable homosexual since youth, and I figured that as long as I didn't hurt anyone, that it would not be a problem. I visited multiple doctors about this. I mean, he writes it all out, and he gives it to the CIA, his friends, of course, in the CIA, because they're all these guys are part of the Georgetown Set. That's the name of a book about this very powerful clique of influential journalists and power players in Washington in this era. And he writes it all down, and it gets into J. Edgar Hoover's hands, right? But it has no impact on federal government policy. They're still purging gay people left and right. So the fact that this man who's in this exact situation that you claim is happening all the time, and by the way, not once is there a recorded instance of a gay person turning over sensitive information to a foreign power because they're blackmailed, okay? So this entire pretext that sort of seems like it might make sense on the face of it, right? You might think, even if you're a liberal person, you might think, yes, this is a terrible secret in the time of 1950s, and yeah, maybe we shouldn't let gay people serve because they might be vulnerable to blackmail. There's actually not a single example of it ever happening.
But what's great about Alsop is that he could then be blackmailed by the Soviets and his own government at any moment, yes. And yet he didn't budge an inch in his writing. He didn't change any positions, and he carried on writing, and then which is just, I mean, as a writer under that kind of threat, that is integrity.
Whatever you think of his views.
Yes.
His views on Vietnam were, I mean, he was a dead ender on Vietnam. And then what happens in the early 70s? In the early 70s, unmarked manila envelopes start arriving in people's mailboxes across Washington with these photographs taken in 1957. And they are sent to about a dozen people, including his worst enemy, Art Buchwald, who was a humor columnist. Art Buchwald had actually written a play making fun of Joe Alsop. He wrote an entire play mocking Joe Alsop. They gave the photos to him, and Art Buchwald did not do anything with them. Whereas, can you imagine today if this sort of thing happened? I mean, it'd be up on Twitter in 2 minutes. But there was this sort of, among a certain class of people in Washington in that era, there was kind of a gentleman's agreement, right? And Joe Alsop was unique. I'm not pointing to him as being in any way representative of people in Washington. Most people in Washington would not have this sort of protection. But because he was part of this class of people, even his worst enemy, Art Buchwald, didn't do anything with that photograph, put it right in the trash. Yeah.
And we mustn't forget the organizer of the March on Washington, Bayard Rustin, the great Bayard Rustin.
Who's really one of the
extraordinary person.
One of the real moral titans of the 20th century, who we don't know enough about. We don't teach him enough in our schools. And he really is up there with Martin Luther King.
And then going forward, because I want to get us up to snuff, Nixon. Now, Nixon's relationship with homosexuality is, to my mind, is fascinating because he was the only president really obsessed with it.
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes in the book is because you have the tapes in the White House, and Nixon goes, "Well, whenever you let that stuff run wild, it's the end of the country. I mean, look at the Greeks. Isn't that so, Henry?" And Henry just says, "Well," and then he's cut off. And it was that well. Henry Kissinger is like, "Okay, how am I going to get through this one?" Surrounded by, so...
Well, his chief speechwriter was a gay man. Ray Price.
The person who came up with the silent majority.
Yes. Well, there's an interesting story. He came up with quiet majority.
Okay.
Which Nixon actually used that term quiet majority during the campaign. And then, after he's elected, after 1968 and the riots at the Chicago Convention, it's Pat Buchanan who edits it and says it's silent majority, right? So they're not quiet anymore, they're silent. And it's this interesting dynamic between Ray Price, who's what used to be called a liberal Republican. They used to exist. Okay? He was an editorial writer for the New York Herald Tribune, one of the great liberal Republican newspapers of the time. And he was sort of, he was the angel on Nixon's shoulder, right? And then he was, he went to Yale, he was in Skull and Bones. And then there's Pat Buchanan, who is the populist Catholic firebrand devil on Nixon's shoulder. And the two of them are sort of competing for Nixon's, attention here. But yeah, Ray Price, there's only two people I out in the book. Ray Price is one of them, and my views on outing are similar to yours. I have a very high bar for people who are alive.
If they're dead.
If they're dead, they belong to history, is my view on this. And I know even there was this remarkable piece in the Times a couple weeks ago about Ed Koch, where they posthumously outed him. And there are many people, often straight people, who are like, oh, this is not right. Why are you doing this? Why does the sex life matter? And my view is if the man who represented literally the block where gay liberation began, right? He represented Greenwich Village. He represented the district where the Stonewall Inn is located. If this man, who represented probably the most pro-gay friendly district in the country, if he felt the need that he could not be out of the closet, even long after his political career, so there's no political consequences, if that man, if the closet was so destructive and so constricting that man felt the need to be within it his entire life, we need to know that as a country and as a society.
Right.
People need to know that, I think. Right? Is that fair to say? Yeah.
I thought of another one, Cardinal Spellman, hugely powerful.
Spellman, yes.
Gay man.
You're a Catholic. I'll let you talk about it.
No, I'm not going to talk about it. But I'm just saying, what is remarkable is that what Jamie has done is tell history. This is just history with gay people at its center, not hidden away, but actually, and it's happening in the center of power.
Right.
But you talk about that climate of, and we'll finish with this because it's important. There is a hero here. There is someone who just decided at some point in ways that no one else had done and very few people would do for a while, and say, you're not firing me because I'm gay. That's not a good reason. I'm going to sue you. Tell us about Frank Kameny.
Frank Kameny was a Harvard-trained astronomer who in 1957, he was working for the Army Map Service, which is basically it's the predecessor to the Geospatial Intelligence Agency today. And this is, Sputnik. It's the height of the Cold War. We need really smart Harvard-trained astronomers working for us, right? He is fired for being gay, and he is the first person to challenge this and sue the federal government. And I actually had an insight the other day. I'm trying to think, what would that be like? Because there's no openly gay, this notion of an openly gay person, that does not exist. No. Okay? And what is it like? You know what it's like? And it's a very appropriate analogy, because Frank was an astronomer. It's sort of like Galileo saying the earth is round and it revolves around the sun. And everyone in society is telling him you're crazy, and they oppress him, right? They put him in jail, and he refuses to admit. He refuses to say the earth is flat. I think that's, to be a gay person in 1957 and say, no, you know what? Homosexuality is a morally neutral trait, and I'm not sick. You're sick. The society is sick. It's like Galileo. It really is that transformative, I think.
He had one phrase: gay is good.
Yeah.
It wasn't neutral. It was good. Right. It was like the
black is beautiful.
Black is beautiful, but gay is good. Now he just came out of it. Now we talked about this. We both knew Frank.
Yeah.
And an amazing figure, but he was definitely on the spectrum. And this may also be a moment when somebody neurodivergent, and through that ability to just not see or care about the social reaction, was confronted with a piece of injustice and simply said, without any of the normal terror and panic, and he said, this is wrong. and then actually went ahead. He didn't just. I mean, he wrote letters to everyone. He organized the first Mattachine Society, and in the first meeting was the informer that they all knew was the informer, right?
Which shows you kind of how inept and kind of keystone cops the police often are in my book. So the first meeting of the Mattachine Society is in room 120 of the Hay Adams Hotel, which, by the way, I think that meeting should stand with Stonewall. It should be in the, like,
I think it should be before Stonewall.
Yeah, but we should know that the meeting of the Mattachine Society at the Hay Adams Hotel in August 1961 should be as associated in the public mind, right, with gay history as the Stonewall uprising. It's not, because it's not as sexy as, you know, throwing bricks at cops. And I'm not minimizing what happened at Stonewall. But it's like, you know, it's 12 white men in suits and ties. And we know what happened at this meeting because not only was the FBI surveilling it, they got the manager of the hotel to basically spy on this meeting, who, by the way, reported that the men were very well behaved. They only ordered coffee, and the only words that he could overhear were like bylaws and resolutions. That's all. But then also inside the meeting is a plainclothes undercover police officer from the Metropolitan Police Department, the local police in Washington, D.C., who happened to be the same man that they would use in Vice Squad stings, you know, entrapping gay men in public bathrooms and parks. So he was quite familiar to the men in this room. Not the best idea when you're trying to think of someone to send undercover into a meeting of homosexuals. You send the guy who's arrested half of them, you know, over the past couple, who's very handsome, obviously, right? Because you have to pick the most handsome guy in the force. So Frank, Frank's an incredible character and suffered and paid for it. I mean, I don't know if you ever visited Frank at his house in Washington. He lived in a decrepit, partly because he was a pack rat and, again, perhaps autistic, right? But this man sacrificed. I mean, he was living on 25 cents a day for years because he could not get a job. Because you have to keep in mind federal contractors as well, right? So here's a guy with a Harvard PhD who, in that era during the Cold War, all these companies that, you know, are dealing with technology, they're all contracting with the federal government in some way. So he can't get employed. He's living on 25 cents a day. He told me when I interviewed him that oftentimes having a pat of butter on his mashed potatoes was a luxury. He'd consider himself lucky if he could afford the 5 cents for a pat of butter on his mashed potatoes. And
that's a Harvard PhD.
Harvard PhD, right? And how many other people like that suffered that we don't know about? But and I feel like our gay, you know, I felt it was a shame. Yeah, it was just a shame what he went through, and he was remarkably not bitter about it. And he put it to good use. And I actually, one of the inspirations for writing this book was I went to the ceremony in 2009, early in the Obama administration, where OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, which is the successor organization to the Civil Service Commission, which was the bureaucracy that was responsible for purging gay people across the civil service, they apologized to Frank. And it was a ceremony with Michelle Obama, the First Lady, and the head of OPM, who was an openly gay man. So it had this kind of poetic justice to it. But the federal government officially apologized to Frank Kameny in 2009, and he accepted it. And it was
in my view, next year June they should have a stamp.
Yeah.
Poster stamp with this man's face on it.
Absolutely.
It is a scandal to me. I mean, I joke up about it because, you know, that's courage of an incredible kind. And we owe so much to that. Because even though it was the consciousness shift.
Yeah. Someone
publicly to say, I'm okay, gay is good. He was incredibly important in getting rid of the 1973 APA judgment of homosexuality as a mental illness. He led the first picket outside the White House, where he insisted with these beautiful, very well done posters, everyone wearing suits and ties. They had to. He wanted the 3 lesbians.
If you want to be employed, look employable. That's what
that was his statement. And he wanted the lesbians to wear high heels, actually, but they talked him out of that. There was some definite.
There were a lot of lesbian, gay, male tensions.
There was, partly because, you know, so much of this oppression is actually not as great for lesbians. I mean, it's actually concentrated on men because of their sexual behavior. They're the people being thrown in jail. I mean, 100%.
They also are in jobs that require security clearances, so they were subject to greater scrutiny.
But when you're a lesbian and every agenda is about public cruising, sex arrests.
And lesbians are like, why are we here? Why are we? What are we doing in these meetings where all we talk about are you guys going off and getting arrested for sex in public bathrooms? So there was a lot of tension in the early gay rights movement.
A very good lesbian question. So there's a great hope, and there's a wonderful storyline in the book, and I think you rightly don't take us into the 21st century. That it would be inappropriate, I think, to really be able yet to understand that history. We're all, I think, grateful for it, and mazel tov.
Thank you.
And thanks for coming.
Thank you.